Do you want to learn 3 methods for making half square triangles? If you do, I have the perfect tutorial for you today. We are going to cover how to make 2 at a time, 4 at a time, and 8 at a time half square triangles. So let's get started on this fun tutorial. For this tutorial, you'll need a few supplies. I've grabbed some fabrics from my stash. These are all Tula Pink. You'll need quilting rulers, a marking pen or pencil, your rotary cutter, and a rotating cutting mat is also helpful. And then of course you'll need your sewing machine, thread, and your usual sewing supplies. Let's get your supplies together and get started. One of my biggest tips when making half square triangles is to make them larger than you need your unfinished size so that you have room for trimming along all 4 edges. This allows us to trim those edges off that may have become distorted or uneven during the sewing process, and then after trimming we have a nice precise size before we sew it into our quilt blocks. If you want more information about what size you should be making your half square triangles, I have a great guide for you that I've linked down in the description below for making half square triangles in various methods. Let's start with the 2 at a time method for making half square triangles. You'll need 2 squares of fabric of the same size depending on your final unfinished size. And what we'll do on the back of one of our fabric squares is draw a line from corner to corner. And you can use a friction pen or mechanical pencil. You can even use a regular pen. It doesn't matter because we will actually be cutting on that drawn line, so it won't be seen in your final project. And any ruler will be fine to line up your corner to corner, and then you'll just draw that line. There we go. And then place that square right sides together with your other fabric square. And at this point I like to pin, and you can pin wherever you'd like. If you'd like to pin here in the middle, you can. Just be aware that you'll need to remove this as you're sewing. Or you can pin outside away from that drawn line, and then you don't have to worry about moving the pins as you sew. Now some people don't like to pin, but I find that it really helps avoid shifting of my fabrics as I'm sewing. I like to chain piece my fabrics, and it really helps all of the squares to stay in place as I'm doing that. Now at this point what we will do is go over to our sewing machine, and you will sew 1/4 inch on either side of the drawn line. So 1/4 inch on this side and 1/4 inch on this side. So let's go over to my sewing machine and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, here we are at my sewing machine, and we are going to sew 1/4 inch on either side of the drawn line. As I mentioned, I have my 1/4 inch. Actually, I'm using a scant 1/4 inch in this half square triangle. If you don't know the difference or how to find each of those, I have a great video that I'll link for you as well on how to find an accurate 1/4 inch seam and scant 1/4 inch seam. So now we're just going to sew on either side of our drawn line. Now at this point, if I was sewing multiple blocks, I would go ahead and chain piece them and put them through, but I'm only sewing this one block. So what I like to do, just to save time and effort, I don't cut my threads, and I just turn my block and then position with the needle down, position the next side to sew down. And then I'm not cutting my threads, so I'm conserving thread, and then it makes for quicker sewing as well. And you'll notice we left these pins over to the side so they didn't interfere with our sewing, so we didn't even need to move those as we were sewing. So now I will sew 1/4 inch down the next side. And now you can see we have our drawn line in the middle, down the diagonal of our block, and our 1/4 inch sewn on either side. So let's go back over to our workstation and I'll show you how to finish this up. Okay, we're back from the sewing machine, and I'm going to take these pins out. And now you can see, as I showed you, we have our drawn line and 2 sewn lines on either side. And at this point, we are going to trim on the drawn line. So taking any ruler, just place that along your drawn line and then cut. And now we have our 2 half square triangles. Aren't they beautiful? And you can trim these using whichever method you prefer. I'll show you towards the end of the video my preferred method and a few tips on trimming, but let's go ahead and go to the next method of making half square triangles. The next method of making half square triangles that I'm going to show you is actually my favorite, and that is the 4 at a time method. Now, the great thing about the 4 at a time method is we don't need to mark anything on our blocks, so we can put our pen and ruler aside. You simply need 2 blocks of the same size, and we'll place those right sides together. And this time I like to put a pin in the middle of my block. Depending on how large your fabric is, you may need more than 1 pin, but I have a small block, so I'm only going to use 1 pin. Now we will sew 1/4 of an inch on the edges of our fabric square. So the entire outside 1/4 of an inch. And this may seem strange to you, but trust me, it's going to be great, and it's so fast and easy to chain piece these. So I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and sew this 1/4 of an inch, and I'll be right back. Okay, I am back from my sewing machine, and I've removed my pen, and as you can see, I have my 1/4 of an inch sewn down each side of my fabric square. Okay, and I've also gotten out my rotating cutting mat. It makes things a lot easier, and I'm going to show you why. So you'll place your fabric square on your cutting surface. We are going to be cutting along the diagonal in this direction and in this direction to form an X. When using the 4 at a time half square triangle making method, when we cut these, you will be exposing biased edges of your fabric. So there's a greater chance that your fabric could distort or get stretched. So you want to make sure that you're taking care when you're cutting, and then especially when you're pressing your blocks and sewing them in. It's something that you want to make sure that you keep in mind as you go along in the process, because if you don't, you could end up with some wonky edges, and we don't want that. But it's definitely something that can be addressed with proper handling of your blocks. And then also, I like to starch my fabrics ahead of time. I find that it gives them more structure, and I don't have as many problems with working with the biased edges. So let's go ahead and cut our block. We'll place our ruler along the diagonal of our square and then cut. Now you don't want to move anything at this point, so just lightly pick up your ruler, and this is where I mentioned that a rotating cutting mat is helpful. We'll just rotate the mat instead of moving the block. We don't want to disturb it. And then gently place your ruler back on your fabric, lining up the diagonals again, and then cut. And then here we have 4 beautiful half square triangles. How simple was that? This is actually my favorite method for making half square triangles. The sewing is so quick on these, especially if you're making a lot. You can chain piece them, and just sewing along the edges just makes things so much simpler. So that's the 4 at a time method. Drop me a comment below and let me know what you think so far. And now I have one other method for making half square triangles for you, so let's get to it. The next method that we're going to be using for half square triangles is the 8 at a time method. Now I have 2 squares of fabric again, and we will be marking on these similar to the 2 at a time method, but this time we're going to be marking on this diagonal and this diagonal. So we'll take our ruler and draw a diagonal line in both directions. Just placing that corner to corner, making sure that we are exactly in our corners. And there we have it. And then I'll take my other fabric square and place this right sides together, lining up the edges. And now we will be sewing 1/4 of an inch down both sides of the drawn line in both directions. Okay, so what I like to do with my pins in this case is place them again in areas where I will not be sewing. So usually I place them in these 4 triangle areas. And then now we'll go to the sewing machine, and again 1/4 of an inch down both sides in both directions. Okay, I am back from my sewing machine, and you can see that I have 1/4 of an inch on both sides of my drawn line. So I've made an X essentially and sewn along both sides of that. So now I'll go ahead and remove my pins because I don't need those anymore. And again, I will get out my rotating cutting mat because this is very helpful in this method as well. We will be trimming not only along the drawn lines, but also in the middle of our square. So this direction and this direction to reveal the 8 half square triangles. Because I know that my stitches are helping hold everything together, what I like to do first is cut down the center of my block in both directions, and then that way if any of my fabric gets moved, I know that the stitches are holding everything together. And I'll show you more as we go along. So you'll just take your ruler and line up here and here. You'll want to make sure that you pay attention to the center of your drawn line and make sure that your ruler is going through that area, but then also staying in line on each side and your bottom as well. So once I have everything lined up, I'll cut down that center line. Okay, and again, we don't want to move our fabric. That's why the rotating cutting mat is helpful. And then we'll place our ruler in the opposite direction to cut down the middle of our block. Lining everything up and then cut. Now we still need to cut on our drawn lines, but remember I told you that I like to cut in this direction first in case anything shifts. Let me show you why I said that. If we separate these, we actually have a 2 at a time half square triangle. So you don't have to worry about making all of these cuts and keeping your fabric from shifting. If you make those first 2 cuts, now you just have 4 blocks that you need to cut, and there's no need to worry about your fabric shifting. You can actually separate them if it's easier for you and cut along the drawn lines. Okay, now everything is cut, and look, we have 8 beautiful half square triangles. Wasn't that easy and fast? So now as a special bonus tip, I'm going to show you how I like to trim my half square triangles without any specialty rulers. Because we're not using a specialty ruler, I'll need to press my blocks open completely, and then I'll meet you back here for my special bonus tip. Okay, I am back with a bonus tip for you on trimming your half square triangles without a specialty ruler. So I have one of my half square triangles. I've pressed it to one side. Both of these fabrics were darker, so it didn't really matter which side I pressed it to. You can also press your seams open if that's what you like. And then I'm just going to take one of my Creative Grids rulers, and it doesn't matter what size that you're using, as long as it is at least the size that you need to trim your half square triangle. But it can be larger, and I'm going to show you how that can work as well. Now I need my half square triangle at 4.5 inches, so you want to make sure that you've identified where your lines are on your ruler. And then also, most quilting rulers, if not all of them, will have a diagonal line, and you want to make sure and identify that as well. So I know that I need to line up this diagonal line on my ruler with the diagonal line on my half square triangle. So one of my tips for you is you want to make sure that you're leaving room to trim on all 4 sides of your half square triangle. That way you have clean edges along all 4 sides. So when you lay your ruler down for the first cut, don't line up this side with your edge like this and then make your cut. What we want to do is give ourselves a little bit of extra room there and here. If you've made your half square triangles oversized enough, then you should have room. This is one of the reasons that in my ultimate half square triangle guide, I give those recommendations so that you do have the room for trimming on all 4 sides. So again, we want to line up the diagonal line with the diagonal line on our half square triangle. And again, you can see my 4.5 inch mark is here, and I've left myself room for trimming in the second step. And then I have the room here for trimming. So we'll go ahead and make that first cut. Okay, and now at this point, we have 2 clean edges. So we're going to flip the block. And now is the time that we want to line up our final measurement and the diagonal line. So again, I need mine at 4.5 inches. So I'm going to line up the 4.5, line up the diagonal line, make sure everything is straight, hold my ruler and cut. And there you have it, a perfectly trimmed half square triangle with a regular quilting ruler, no specialty rulers necessary. So there we have our 3 methods for making half square triangles. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Let me know in the comments below what you think. What's your favorite way to make half square triangles? And if you enjoyed this video, do me a favor and give me a thumbs up on the video. It allows me to keep creating content for you. I had so much fun with you making these half square triangles. Aren't they gorgeous? I need to find a project to make with them. I'm anxious to hear what you're going to do with your half square triangles too.